The topic tonight is an odd one. Uh, First of all, let me ask, how many of you are looking forward to working on pieces of hardware? Show of hands. Any engineers at all? 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and how many of you think you're going to do public service? Okay. All right. Well, this topic is an odd one for both classes of individual, in that it's a security threat that has not yet occurred. In the catalog of problems, it's a bit like worrying about the 30-foot wave of global warming, a collision of an asteroid against the surface of the Earth. Now, certain kinds of speculative, or perspective, maybe that's the way to put it, threats, garner a lot of public interest and concern. Others don't. You'll notice, for example, there's not a course on why we don't have gravity trucks. Does anybody know what a gravity truck is? Oh, my. Well, you do. Oh, there's a nod. Okay, so there is somebody. Not crazy. Well, in other words, you could work on the problem of how to make sure that asteroids don't hit the planet Earth. And if you did, you'd be consumed with trying to figure out how to develop things like gravity trucks that would deflect them and things like that. But we're not that much. But we are very interested in global warming. And we're very interested, I think, still to some great extent about this topic. Certainly it was all the rage up until this presidency. And it's useful to know why and how. It's kind of like trying to understand, the futures and concern and threat in the public sector. So most of tonight's lecture will be dedicated to teasing away how to think about this threat and related threats and why we focus on these things. It'll give you an idea of how much you might focus on a particular aspect of this threat if you're an engineer. It might give you some idea of why and when we might focus more or less on this. And because it goes through cycles. It is not, the level of concern and interest has been high, low, and high. It's changed. So trying to understand that is sort of what I'm going to be poking at. I don't think I've done as good a job as is needed. On the other hand, I find most of the people who deal with nuclear terrorism do so perhaps with more enthusiasm than I do. And as a result, they don't see the cycle. They don't see the changes. So there's a certain advantage to being somewhat skeptical. I will try to make the best case I can for why you should be concerned about this as well. You may find more enthusiastic presenters than myself, in all honesty. So, I'm stating my prejudices up front. So what are we going to focus on? I guess we could go to the next slide. It's okay. Unfortunately, it has prose on it, which is a sort of a example of what not to do with PowerPoint. If there isn't a picture and it doesn't move or doesn't show you an X and Y axis, you probably shouldn't bother with it. But there it is, 4 questions. What is the history of our interest in nuclear terrorism? And I think the reason I brought that up is to show you that, well, it's gone up and it's gone down. And why is associated a little bit with, what happened in the past. And that may help us answer, what drives interest in this. Then there is the question of, well, why are we so worried about nuclear terrorism by non-state actors? If you look up the word terrorism or terrorist, it isn't necessarily inflicted by non-state actors. A couple examples. In the Second World War, they talked about terror bombings. The V-1 and V-2 attacks against Great Britain were considered terror attacks and terror bombings. I suppose if you were German or Japanese, you would view the Allied bombings of places like Dresden, Cologne, and Tokyo, and while we're at it, Nagasaki and Hiroshima as terror attacks or terror bombings. When we talk about nuclear terrorism, though, seem to be focused very much on non-state actors. It's interesting. Recently, I think within the last year, President Trump referred to North Korea threatening us with nuclear terrorist attacks. He wasn't talking about people with satchels. He was talking about missiles. So there is this other way of looking at terrorism, which is not with state actors. So, why are we worried about non-state actors? It's an interesting question. The third question, I think, is incorrectly written. It's hard getting good help. I wrote this. How much of a threat is nuclear terrorism with nuclear weapons versus the kind of nuclear terrorism we've experienced since 1945, which is nuclear terrorism without nuclear weapons? We certainly have experienced fear and terror about possible attacks, but we have not yet experienced a nuclear terrorism threat with nuclear weapons. We have not seen use. So how much of a threat is that in the future, we need to ask. And then I thought I'd catalog a few things that get sometimes talked about, but aren't, I guess, strictly speaking, by definition, terrorist attacks, but what are some other frightening nuclear threats short of total war? Now, in the sort of the tradition of what I call the Texas School of writing, you're supposed to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I suppose I will give you short answers to these questions now. I just gave a lecture in San Diego yesterday, and there were 120 people. I'd say 10% of them had the notebooks up and were buying online. So as soon as I got done with the summation, they went into a buying frenzy. So then some professor who was sponsoring this announced that it would be on the exam, and all that changed. I don't know how this works here, so I will give you the review. I think the history of our interest in nuclear terrorism roughly has been driven by, obviously, non-nuclear terrorism. As the latter gets worse, we get more interested in the possibility of what would happen if that non-nuclear terrorist act involved the terrorists having nuclear weapons. And there usually is a jump in interest. And although it's hard to remember, the history of non-nuclear terrorism has not been exponential. Actually, it has not been exponential at all. I'll show that to you. So we'll take a look at that. Why are we so worried about nuclear terrorism by non-state actors? I think basically the reason why is the system of political authority, which is states, and the system of security, which is states threatening one another with acts of violence such that they deter one another from engaging in bad behavior, gets fundamentally turned on its head by the prospect of nuclear terrorism by non-state actors. They are hard to detect, hard to deter, very hard to act against. And so it's an idea that, or a threat that turns everything that we cherish kind of into hash. And I think it's particularly true of institutions driven by the desire for self-government. That's us. And so I think our interest in this is even greater than other places, or ought to be. And then how much of a nuclear threat is nuclear terrorism with nuclear weapons? I'd say right now, at least, far less than you imagine. It's getting greater, but it is not, as advertised, I believe, the most immediate and severe threat we face, which was, I think, roughly the words of at least President Obama, and arguably a good number of Republicans have framed it that way as well, at least in the recent past.